ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the City Club Forum. My name is Kamm. I'm president of the City Club. The City Club is privileged today to bring to its audience here at its club headquarters and to its large radio and television audience one of the country's most distinguished theologians, Dr. Martin E. Marty. Dr. Marty is a distinguished service professor at the University of Chicago, the University of Chicago's Divinity School, that is, where he earned his Ph.D. in 1956 and where since 1963 he has taught the history of modern Christianity. Dr. Marty is a native of Nebraska, but was ordained a Lutheran clergyman in 1952 and served as a pastor for 11 years. Today, in addition to his seminary teaching and lecturing, he's associate editor of the Christian Century, editor of the newsletter Context, and co-editor of Church History. He's the author of a number of books, and in 1972 won the National Book Award for the book titled Righteous Empire. Dr. Marty is past president of the American Society of Church History and is president-elect of the American Catholic Historical Association and is an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I could go on and on. For now, let me dispense with any further description and present to you with great pleasure Dr. Martin E. Marty.
Thank you, dear friends. My topic is Locked in Civil Argument, Religious Contention in America Today, or at least this week. In the quiet of the Rose Garden, the president asked for a school prayer amendment, and we began to hear civil argument immediately. Senator Hart typically saying, taking prayer, one of the most personal of all religious activities, from the sanctity of the home or the place of worship, and thrusting it into the public school demeans the significance of prayer by saddling it with the mantle of governmental interference. That's how you talk in politics. Let me talk about how we talk in religion. The Baptist Joint Committee on Public Affairs, which represents 27 million Baptists in 9 denominations, said what the president did was engage in despicable demagoguery for the president to play petty politics with prayer. Now you know something about our language. Religious contention in America today. When we say religion, we usually mean 3 things. 1, the institutions themselves, the churches, the synagogues, the denominations. And they are very civil and very polite these days. It's unheard of for a Baptist to say anything negative about a Methodist or a Catholic about a Jew. We've learned our manners. We are a little more contentious when we move beyond institutions like church and synagogue to what I call clienteles or causes or constituencies, which tend to gather around a single individual or a single issue and are very vibrant because of that, because the individual who gathers them has charismatic force, or because the issue is something that deeply troubles the society. An argument on that level is much more intense. And in addition to the institutions and the clienteles, there's the third dimension, namely all of our private lives. Whether or not we are members of religious institutions, or favor them or not, most of us are somehow in the business of doing in our own lives what religion historically has done in people's lives. It serves as the basis for our finding meaning. Sociologist Talcott Parsons has said that people in culture cannot well sustain a life in which everything is completely random, haphazard, ad hoc, up for grabs. We need to endow our fortunes and our misfortunes and our joys and our sorrows with meaning. That historically has been the role of religion, which then carries over into a desire for belonging. Who am I? My identity is locked up very much with my identification with people who seek meaning on the same track, with the same vision, or toward the same goal. Now, why would those 3 rootages ever lead to the issue of contention, contesting, arguing, debating? Why religion for that? I have no doubt that if we'd poll anyone in range of my voice and ask them what they'd like to have religion do in their life, it would be very far from their desire to have it add to the hassle and the turmoil and the contention of their lives. In religion, we seek unity with the all, the one, God, our fellows. We seek concord. Sometimes we use religion indeed for escape from some of the tumult. If we worship, we often like to close the sanctuary door and let the light filter through beautiful windows and a different kind of sound reach us with an organ. When the candle burns low, when we have to face our own destiny, we seek the peace, the shalom, the wholeness that comes with religion. Why then is religion a subject of such contention today as it has been throughout human history? For quick reasons. One, because it involves what Paul Tillich called our ultimate concern. The things we're ready to die for, the things we believe most deeply about, the priorities that sort out all other secondary matters in life. And because of that, it's very close to us and we care a lot about it. It can even turn to a fanaticism. The fanatic, said Mr. Dooley, is the one who believes he knows he's doing exactly what the Lord would also do if the Lord were also in possession of the facts. And in a way, it is a tribute to religion that people care enough about it, their ultimate concern. But you can see, therefore, that it's easily exploitable. It's very easy for a cause or constituency to gather its people into contention over against all outsiders. And most religions in their earliest stages have that character. Judaism did, Christianity did, just as much as some of the new intense religious groups in our society today do. Second reason is because the stories we tell each other, in religion we call them myth, by which we don't mean untrue, we mean formal stories. The symbols around which we rally, a cross, a Star of David, or whatever, are, again, means of focusing our energies and finding who is trustworthy. The third reason is because religion has so much to do with the explanations we give to things in life. A truly religious person will have things worked out so that no circumstance of the world will really throw you off that track. A passage in the Bible, though he slay me, yet will I trust him, is a deep profession of faith of a sort that guards one against ever coming into a circumstance that would lead to an absence of trust, or for a pattern of action. Martin Luther is said to have said, if they told me the world is to end tomorrow, I would still plant my cherry tree today. Because the set of explanations you have don't let you be disturbed by mere things like end of the world or your own death. And if you care that much about them, you worry about losing those explanations. And many people in our culture today are religiously contentious because they see such sudden change in the world around them, in the moral and value patterns in our culture, that they fear a kind of a personal shipwreck. And the fourth reason why religion is part of contention is that a fulfilled religion has a lot to do with our behavior. We eat this, we don't eat that. We spend our Friday nights or our Sundays this way and not that way. We bring up our children this way and not that way. We say, that isn't done. Or in our group, that's how we do it. And when we run into people who are alien to those ways of doing things, we feel threatened. All four of those are a complement to religion, but they also point to its danger. Thus, if you look at the world today, religion is very much a part of most of the wars that are going on. I haven't yet found a root in the Falkland Island dispute that is clearly religious, but you have to have some exceptions now and then. Annually, I write a column for Britannica and World Book yearbooks on the world of religion that year, and almost every year a new editor is taken over and has to get acquainted with how we cover religion and writes back and says, I'm not sure this belongs under religion, I think it belongs under military affairs. People who believe deeply, who have certain common stories, who have certain explanations, and certain actions are threatened by other people. 2 years ago, if you'd look in that book, you'd see I'm writing about a time when some Muslims in the north part of India killed a sacred cow, and there was a Hindu-Muslim war that took lives. The next year, a pig belonging to some Hindus strayed onto Muslim soil, and that led to this kind of conflict. And at our distance, we think that's sad but also humorous, but I think if they'd find what we're fighting about, they might find some humor to things we care greatly about. The Middle East, Jewish, Muslim, Northern Ireland, Protestant Catholic, many parts of Africa, almost anywhere there's a world in turmoil, there is a religious connection with a war that may have economic roots or many other kinds of roots. Domestically, a great amount of the energies of our society go into religiously based issues, and I'll spell a few of them out in a little while. Let's take the two ways contention tends to show up in the world, in America today, and I'll give you about 5 quick illustrations of what I call macro issues, and then, for equal time, 3 more colorful micro illustrations. This might be a little guide to the 80s, so maybe I'm giving you a do-it-yourself kit for avoiding no man's land, no person's land, which I just failed to avoid. For a sample, a religious dimension to one of the most troubling, important, and exciting issues of our time, if not of history, the issue of nuclear disarmament. You can't tell the players without a program. The religious rootage that leads people to the convictions they have are not anchored in a predictable political or religious pattern as to liberal or conservative. Thus, the most conservative of all the Roman Catholic cardinals in America, John Kroll of Philadelphia, has been very public in the movements for nuclear freeze and disarmament. Billy Graham, a more moderate figure, but still clearly, through his 30 years of public career, identified more with conservative than with liberal causes, is devoting, he says, half of the energies of the rest of his life to this issue. While he preaches the gospel, he will work on the issue of human survival on these terms. People of roughly equal distinction are on the other side as well, arguing that the stewardship of life might involve certain kinds of risks and that nuclear armament is part of that. That's going to lead to a lot of contention in the years ahead, and the religious symbolization, we are doing it because of what we believe our God, our divine power, our tradition impels us to do, will add an intensity to it. The issue that has to remain with us in the 1980s, the issue of welfare, care of the poor in our own society in a time of inflation and governmental cutback, is leading people in the churches to ask, how do we, A, fill the gap, and B, what stand do we take politically to see whether we're in the most creative address for this kind of thing? It leads to a great deal of contention. A couple of weeks ago, in an extremely chance remark based on my little bit of mathematics, I got picked up in the Wall Street Journal as simply saying that there's no way that we could satisfy the president's desire that the churches take care of all welfare need by adopting 10 welfare families each. I pointed out that the churches he knows aren't the churches I know. The average Protestant church in America has 270 members, some of them on welfare, many of them aged, some of them unemployed, many of minority groups, and for them to move their budget up by $100,000 next year was a little bit utopian. And one of the prominent television folks have ever since used me almost daily as an example of a liberal theologian who's been saying the churches should do something about welfare, and now we get a great chance, and he says we shouldn't. He and I have to meet. I think there's a little clarification necessary. Number 3, world hunger and poverty. This is a very interesting issue. As you hear me spin these out, you might find why the issues in the life of the religious groups in America today on the macro issues turn out a little different than they did the last round, the 1960s, when they were rather simple, all or nothing affairs. Stay in or get out of Vietnam, integrate or segregate, have civil rights legislation or not. It's much more complex today. Different kinds of expertise are needed. Agronomy, agriculturalists, economists, lay and clerical members with different kinds of expertise. We've learned that to use a pesticide of a certain sort spreads cancer, and not to use a pesticide means too small a crop yield and people die. Tied to the issues of triage, do you breed a new generation of more hungry mouths, or what do you do, suggests that it's very hard for people to follow lines that used to be called liberal or conservative. Both sides, all sides, however, will be moving by their vision of what it is that their God calls them to or their religion calls them to, because so far as I know, none of the great faiths of our world say that you can neglect the hungry or the poor. The battle is over how to do it. And there's going to be contention. The fourth illustration would be the environment. Those who have the Bible of Judaism and Christianity as their book, beginning on page 1, know that they are to be stewards of what they perceive to be the creation God gave them. And this means that they do not have the freedom to ruin it. They have a responsibility for turning it over to the next generation. But how to do that, and what energies to put into that in a troubled economy, leads again to religious contention. And many of the myths and symbols of the environmental cause, the songs sung to guitar accompaniment, the poems written, the photographs spread, have a kind of a sacral religious character to them. Mr. Watt, the Secretary of the Interior, invokes religious passages precisely on the opposite side of the environmental movement, as a very prominent New York Times last week asked him what his religion was. He said, practicing Christian. And other people who are practicing to be practicing Christians are on the other side, and there's a lot of contention. And the social forms of society. My colleague Paul Ricoeur says that at heart every revolution has goods, institutions, and values involved. The world has plenty of goods. Its problem is through what institutions do you assure equity for people to get at them? And that, again, is something in which people have very strong feelings, feelings that are moved also by religion. But I suppose war itself is the most obvious example. World War I, some multilingual doggerel, Gott strafe England, God save the king, God this, God that, and God the other thing. Good God, said God, I've got my work cut out for me. And when thinking how busy he is, as you hear the athletes, both sides of whom are praying for a victory in the Lord's name, you can see that this is an incredible agenda. On the micro level, these are not less important just because they're close to home. To most people, they're more vivid. Are the issues associated in people's minds with religion as it reaches the intimate zones of life? The bedroom, the place where one courts, the way you bring up children, the schools, virtue and vice, and so on. Among them is the one I alluded to before, the call for a school prayer amendment, the belief and the assumption that if one would institute some form of constitutional amendment that would legitimize and authorize prayer in public schools, one might make a contribution to both reverence and moral life in America, versus an equal number of religious people who would say that it trivializes prayer, and even if you use the word voluntary, it is coercive in religion. These are very important debates, even if the amendment itself will probably either way do very little to change American life. They're signals of deeper issues about the intimate things we have, about bringing up our children. Far more important to most people, and I suppose far more important, are the issues that I would say are related to the life cycle. Birth control, abortion, in vitro fertilization, termination of life of the hopelessly misborn fetus or child, the issues of care through the medical processes, who shall live, who shall die, euthanasia. These probably are as close to religion as any. They tell you more, and it's a compliment both to life and to religion, that they tell you this in the deepest parts of your passional nature. And third, those that have to do with sexual expression, which again awaken a great deal of interest in the society, the Equal Rights Amendment, homosexual rights, pornography and obscenity, and the like. In a sense, two different sets of people tend to be expert at the macro or the micro, and it confuses the public when you're expert at both. Thus, a lot of people who are pleased that so many Roman Catholic bishops are critical of the nuclear buildup, a few years ago were saying they had no right to be involved in the abortion debate, even though they were operating on the same set of texts and the same theology or whatever. We get confused when you're expert at both. But I believe it's to the good if we are expert at both. If we don't care about the micro up close to us, can we be trusted in the macro? Do we love humanity but not human beings? And on the other hand, do we only love what we know, what's under our own roof, and forget the 6 billion out there? So the two have to intersect. I'm glad for these contentions, I should say. I'm glad that more and more people are entering the contentions. There are, as of now, as of January, 74 formal client constituency lobby pressure type groups that a person in Congress is aware of. 34 of them are conservative. 26 of those 34 were formed during the last 9 years because the people who were on the conservative side had said until about 1970, as they watched the liberal groups form, that it was a sin to do so, that this was meddling in politics or whatever. And this left them a kind of an often sullen or passive or disorganized side issue. People who, like I, believe that a society should be based on people locked in civil argument should therefore welcome their presence. But my final minutes I'd like to devote now to what civil argument is and looks like. My hero in this cause is the late Jesuit Father John Courtney Murray, who, quoting a Dominican, Thomas Gilby, said, "Civilization is formed by people locked together in argument. People who care about the republic, res publica, about the affairs of the commonwealth. They are not content just to make their religion or their private life their all, but who seek some measure of a common order, some terms that other people can understand." Thus the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, sets forth a set of propositions by which the society claims to live, and then you can debate about how to bring them together. They assume that human beings are intelligent, that reality is somehow intelligible, if still mysterious, and that reality is grasped by intelligible beings who will then try to seek ways to relate to each other. We are locked. Being in the city, the nation, bounded with a certain set of people, most of whom we did not choose. The earliest American phrase is October 12, 1492. Someone on Arawak, Native American of the Taino-speaking group, who sees the Castilians come and says, "Damn it, there goes the neighborhood." From then till now, Americans have developed the art of learning to live with sets of people they would not have chosen. We are locked. Once upon a time, maybe a Protestant majority used to think it could ship back the new Catholics, and the Christian majority thought it could ship back the Jews, and the English speakers might have thought they could ship back the Hispanics. We're here to stay. We are locked by our process. We have to make it work. Opinion, rally, vote, and the like. We are locked by argument. Argument, in Father Murray's terms, and in my application of them, is better than apathy. Apathy always allows a force to come into life and take advantage of those who are unempowered. The more people in the society that you can get into the zone of empowerment and argument, we hypothesize, the better off that society will be, even if it's not as serene as it might like to be. So argument is not apathy. Argument is not talking to oneself, solipsism in philosophical terms, setting a set of terms that no one outside could ever begin to understand. Argument is more than mere self-representation of interest. We expect a person who seriously argues to represent his or her own interests, but for the sake of the common good, we also say you have to, in part, transcend those interests so that you can seek the good of all. Argument is not mere point scoring. What one learns in high school and college debate may be very useful in argument if you go to law school and become a member of a legislature or whatever, but it's not quite the same thing. It's point scoring, whereas the political argument that builds the commonweal always has to find an escape by which the opponent wins something and comes back in and stays in the process. And fifth, argument is not based on confusion. Father Murray says confusion is the easiest thing for a society to have, and we have plenty of it. The hardest thing for a society to have is disagreement. So what is argument? Argument is based on disagreement, on people who care enough about each other to clarify the terms that separate their interest groups. And indeed, in religion, this is often one of the most difficult because we start at such different bases. Argument is designed to represent self-interest and move to the commonweal. Argument assumes that there's value in the political order. Not everyone in religion thinks so. Because politics does not save souls. Politics does not make sad hearts glad. Politics is not designed to make you come to terms with eternal destiny. Politics is a far more modest but terribly urgent human art and craft and science designed to minimize the utter conflict and violence that would belong in the human jungle did we not find means of argument and address to argument. Argument, therefore, sustains the republic. Proposition, Jefferson called it, the proposition of our society, something that is proposed to be debated. And argument, therefore, may lead past disagreement to some kinds of agreement. It's this that people like I these years are saying, let's do our best to redevelop. Let's not look back to the good old days when people in the religious world were passive, as many of them were in the 70s. Let's not look back to other old days when they may have been active, but sometimes mindlessly so. But let's say, how can we use the religious impulses toward these other ends? I once spoke in terms something like this to the New York alumni of the University of Chicago, one of whom, showing that he'd been well trained at the University of Chicago to mistrust all speakers, including faculty from there, said, I have an easy solution. Everything you talked about today, just get rid of religion. I grew up in Tennessee in a little town where they repressed me sexually and wouldn't let me believe in evolution. I went to the library and I read little atheist books, and I got liberated and lived happily ever after, I suppose both sexually and intellectually. And I had to answer, it wouldn't do any good. Religion will not disappear. Some of its forms may disappear, they'll bob up somewhere else. People will not cease the meaning search. The issue is, how creatively can you challenge the passions that go with the deepest beliefs? Murray always worried about the barbarian who would not engage in civil argument. And he said today the barbarian doesn't come with the bear skin that you see in the caveman cartoons carrying a club. Likely, the barbarian today will wear a Brooks Brothers suit or an academic robe and come wielding a ballpoint pen or a typewriter. Civil argument is one that calls us to go up to higher levels of consensus, to reach into levels of generality where we might begin to meet each other, take off the bumper stickers and hear each other. And maybe one of the best ways would be for me to illustrate by the most troubling of the religious issues of our time. When I see a bumper sticker right above the carbon monoxide being belched at me at the staff line that says abortion is murder, the conversation is over. Because if they're trying to win me, they're not going to win me. You don't call someone a murderer and get their attention. On the other hand, a woman's body is her own to do with what she wants is also a conclusion, not a proposition. And it is not something by which any women I know really live. They believe they belong to a human race, they belong to a family, they may belong to a spouse, a lover, they belong to counselors, they belong to a larger context. We are members one of another in civil society, and perhaps in religious, and certainly in familial. And so we seek a term. For example, a proposition. A fetus has rights, but a fetus alone does not have all the rights. Most Americans sign up for that one, and then you can start getting an argument as to what it looks like in legislation, in constitutionality, and in medical care. It will not save souls. It will not make all people happy. This is religion in the political realm. In politics, you win some, you lose some. George Santayana, in a profound essay on American life, once said, it takes two kinds of people to assure the liberties America has. On the one hand, you have a few people whom he called rabid and pensive apostles of liberty who care for no liberty but their own. But in the act of asserting that, they make elbow room for others, and we're always stretching for it. And he said, and then you also need what he called Anglo-Saxon civility, British compromise, a legal tradition that is always trying to find a way to keep including the people who had begun also as rabid and pensive apostles for their own liberty. So this is really a defense on religious grounds of the argument that goes into politics and the political order. And I think that's going to mean for those of us who, like I, are involved in believing communities, that we shall have to put more energy than we did in the past into generating theology, which means explanations, that points to the integrity of people who do not share our faith, the public order itself. Out of this, we will find that this does not mean that you have to give up your deepest religious aspects. Name the great people of our century: Gandhi, Schweitzer, Bonhoeffer, Dorothy Day and Mother Teresa, John the 23rd, Martin Buber, name them all. They are all deeply rooted in their own particular tradition. The last I heard, the Pope was not marginal to Catholicism. Martin Luther King was a black Baptist preacher ready to preach one more day when he was shot, and so on. Deep in a tradition, so deep that they had to reach out. King for Gandhi, Gandhi for Jesus, Buber for European Gentile thought, Bonhoeffer for all kinds of thought that went far beyond his own Protestant background. They went so deep they began to meet a common humanity. They did not meet them by leaving their convictions at the door, but by coming to have a great respect for people who differed from them on matters of ultimate concern, but with whom they shared the human city. Thank you.
You can relax for a couple minutes, Dr. Marty. Thank you, Dr. Marty. Today at the City Club, we are listening to an address by Dr. Marty, noted theologian. Just a few moments, we'll have our traditional question and answer session, but first let me apprise you of a few matters of interest. Today, as always, we have students from area high schools who are participating in our Living Seminars program through the cooperation of the Cleveland Board of Education, which joins us in this venture. With us today are students from the following schools: Cleveland Heights, East Tech Health Career Center, Jane Addams, Richmond Heights, South High, and the Cleveland School of Science. Would you young people kindly rise and receive our welcome? As is our custom, following today's forum, they will be meeting for a seminar of their own with Dr. Marty. Next Friday, there will not be a City Club forum here in this hall, but we will carry on our uninterrupted string of forums when the City Club meets in the famed, beautiful city of Dublin, Ireland, where our City Club contingent will be holding its Friday forum in the Burlington Hotel. There will be a broadcast next Friday, but we're not certain what it will be because we're not certain we can bring that Dublin forum to this city live. 2 weeks from today, we will have the first of 3 debates in connection with the June 8th primary, and I'm sure all of you will want to make reservations for this. The date again is May 21, and the participants in this debate on May 21 will be the Democratic candidates for Congress from the 19th District, and the participants will be the incumbent, Ron Mottle, and the other participants will be Edward Feehan, Melvin Drimmer, and Arnold Gleiser, all of whom, of course, are challenging him for his seat. Be sure to make your reservations early because we expect a full house for that particular forum on May 21. Now for the question period. With Dr. Marty, we have 2 microphones, one in the front of the room with Alan Davis, one in the rear with Bob Conrad. Please raise your hand to be recognized and address your question to Dr. Marty.
Dr. Marty, I'm fascinated, as usual, by what you have to say, especially your references to Father John Courtney Murray. My observation, and this is in the nature of a comment, you may want to respond to some. My observation is one of the great inhibitions to effective argument in religious terms is the sense that many religions seem to convey that you ought not to question or argue or discuss, but simply conform. And in this connection, Father Murray's authorship of a chapter in Vatican II document that I'm sure you're familiar with, which really is a different position on the part of the Catholic Church over its traditional understanding, anyway, as to the position of the Church on the question of authority and the right of the worshiper to a conscientious argument or disagreement.
I'd be glad to comment very briefly because it illustrates the point so well, both inside Catholicism and for the good of the world. Father Murray is not a household word anymore. I regret that. He was Time magazine cover theologian 30 years ago when he was a Jesuit, often in trouble with the church, with his superiors, and he had to be very patient, and he hung in there and came from that questioning position to being the main agent behind the Declaration of Religious Freedom at the Second Vatican Council. Once upon a time, Roman Catholicism, it said error has no rights. After the Second Vatican Council, it says error has rights. We have right to argue with error, but we don't have the right to rule it out of the Republic. This is of awesome importance for the world, to know that the largest element in the largest religion in the world, the most widely dispersed in so many civil societies, has a position in which people are now free to participate fully. They had done so in America, but there was always a little suspicion over the shoulder, and that changed. I think that illustrates. Murray argued effectively at Rome to Catholicism, and he argued effectively in the international and the domestic forum. Not everybody who argues well wins.
Dr. Marty, I would wonder if the combined religions of the world may not pray collectively for peace more than any other single thing, even beyond food and personal needs. This is a tremendous outpouring of energy, time, sincerity, and hope. As a historian, do you see any evidence of a response?
The philosopher Rousseau once said, "You can expect my thoughts to be consistent with each other, but you can't expect me to assert them all at the same time." And today I really biased the issue about religion by speaking of its contentious side. I chose that because that's what people are nervous about. And one could do a far more rhapsodic demonstration of what power religion has by pointing to its impulse toward concord. It doesn't have a good record. It has normally blessed the canon on each side and so on. It doesn't have a good record, but it has the impulse. The great religions are all designed toward that end. Shalom is a root word in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, and has analogs in Buddhism and Hinduism. So the impulse is there, and we are always judged by that. And I think there's no question about it that some of the international network of people who today are working toward peace on whatever terms is motivated by prayer in the separate groups and at great events. I was in Dallas this week, National Day of Prayer, and in that once largely Protestant, now still largely Christian city, they had representatives of Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on, in a prayer for peace. We didn't understand all that was said. It may have been in different languages, but what you call the energy was there, and it is a testimony to the fact there are hundreds of millions of people symbolized by that activity. I would say for those who don't believe in prayer or the power of prayer, it's still important. Somebody has described intercession as loving your neighbor on your knees. And the corollary of that ought to be that when you get up, you'd have to keep loving them. So it might well be that the act of putting the spiritual energy into a prayer leads one then into forms of activity that might also change the world. I'm glad you brought it up because I didn't get to say a single word about the concordant or harmonic dimensions of religious striving. Thank you.
Dr. Marty, I've been asked how come we have an ordained Lutheran minister as president-elect of the American Catholic Historical Association. I said I didn't know, but I'd ask.
We historians are very tolerant of each other. I describe myself as an evangelical Catholic, one foot in the Protestant interpretation of the gospel and the other in the long sense of the tradition that Catholicism has represented. And my students are as often Catholic as Lutheran, and my writings are in all these camps. And so a couple of years ago, the Catholic Historical Association elected me to that end. And they didn't get a single protest vote as far as I know, and we've had Catholic presidents of the once Holy Protestant American side of church history. So much has happened in the recent years as a result of what was not merely argument, but also concordant themes, that it's hard for a public even to grasp it. 21 years ago, just before the Vatican Council, at Collegeville, Minnesota, St. John's, and at Notre Dame, are the only two places I know of where Protestants and Catholics were allowed to talk theology with each other, not the civil affairs, you could always do that, but talk theology. And we were in both cases allowed to burn a candle and say the Lord's Prayer as long as we wouldn't tell anyone. Now remember, these were the best bishops on both sides allowing us to do this. And today it's taken for granted in any local community. So this would be a suggestion again, that people of goodwill and great risk, think of the risk that Pope John took, think of the risk the Protestant took who talked to him, people of great goodwill and great risk can, without giving up everything back at home, come to new measures of concord. If we can't, there's really no purpose in having a political order or any common life. If we're only going to do, this is the tragedy, I think, of today's UN, where each nation simply gets up and makes its statement. You never hear of a position changing. You always know in advance what the vote is going to be, and the speeches are sort of idle, because something is broken down in the search for true movement beyond self-interest. From the Catholic Historical Association to the UN is a big leap. Same point, I hope. Please.
How can we best deal with the widely held American view that the Russians are militaristic monsters who want to take over the world? So many of those Americans are in our conservative churches.
Well, so many of those Americans in our liberal churches, too. So many of us liberals are in that church, too. What I want to say is, in other words, I believe my own participation, for example, in anything of the nuclear sort, and to my delight, the participation by so many Roman Catholic bishops in it, is most credible to the degree that we can show that it is not born of a simple naivete that every other force in the world is benign or whatever. I personally believe that we become obsessive about just the Soviet Union. Many nations now have the bomb. I worry more about it in the hands of a Gaddafi or a Castro, who is not as likely to calculate as I am the Soviet Union, who has good rational reasons for calculating whether it's useful or not. So I do believe that it is possible for our society, religious and not, liberal or conservative, to become obsessive about a single power until we assume there are no bases for them to also have to calculate and reason. I don't think you can get away from it by saying they don't have the weapons. I think you get away from it by saying we dare not rely only on weapons, and mere stockpiling of weapons doesn't mean more to rely on. It may mean more than just madness of some sort. So I would just try to suggest to people that there are, they should diffuse their fears. They have far more things to worry about than just one nation. And in the process, you put that nation into perspective. And I think this can be done on religious grounds as well. Not everything in history, most believers believe, is in their hands entirely. And in a sense, it arrogates to the human the notion that we are sort of God if we become the people who decide for all ages whether there should be a future human race or whatever. And I think that's a religious judgment that can be used along the way. I was simply, in my response to you, trying to say I don't think that awe or fear of Soviet military might and stockpiling is the preservative only of conservatives in churches. I think it's useful for all of us to have that and then ask, what am I going to do with my awe or my fear? Will it paralyze me? Will I engage in mad action? Or will I use that as a basis for a different kind of consequent action?
Dr. Marty, about a dozen years ago, there was a lot of hoopla within mainline Protestant churches about the consultation on church union. Theoretically, that still exists. What future do you see for it?
Okay, the consultation on church union is a movement designed to bring together the main, both white and black, historic Protestant churches. And it is in eclipse today. What is its future? I doubt if there's much future for it along its old lines. It may very well be a forum seeking a new direction. The reason there's not a lot of future for it along its old lines is, in football terms, it got blindsided. You're running down the field and you don't see it, and something comes at you. And something came at you was a different set of issues and a different set of opportunities. Somebody blocked for you. Well, as I said at the beginning of my lecture, Methodists don't fight Baptists anymore. And so why get them together, some people will ask. Methodists fight Methodists and Baptists fight Baptists. That's, that's a little harder to get together. But the model that was using, that we could really produce a concord on that level. I think I would say instead, the ecumenical movement in that form may be in trouble today. Am I too optimistic to say the ecumenical spirit never had it so good? In local communities, in villages, in parts of the city, wherever, people with faithfulness to their own traditions truly are learning both to act with and to think with others. They may oppose them on one issue and unite with them on another, but they're just not as patient for the long committee processes that would lead to something which many of them feel might cause a loss of some of the colorful things in their heritage. My own model, therefore, would be one in which you would keep the color of these separate traditions. Most people in the consultation on church union feared it would be unity by subtraction. The things I really liked, I had to give up. I like to see unity by addition. I got to glob up all these other things that other people are also a part of. I learn other musical traditions. I learn other customs and practices and ways of looking at reality. And for that, the consultation on church union was well-intentioned, but just couldn't keep up.
Dr. Marty, back in high school, we would have debated about television, whether it was a blessing or a curse. Could you comment on television and its relationship to violence? All
right. Is television a blessing or a curse? Yes. And its contribution to violence. By saying it the way I did, I believe that television as such, in its own way, is mainly and chiefly a stepping up of a technology that was implicit in the human story for a long time. I was at a conference recently, a couple of years ago, on the decline of the West, where we were all supposed to see the decline of the West because of technology. And one of the speakers gave an address on the terrible things that were happening because all the communication was increasing. And a librarian of Congress, Daniel Borston, said, "That's a very interesting speech. It's almost exactly the speech that was given against the telephone in 1876. Whereas the telephone, which can be a curse, can be a blessing. A person in a senior citizen's home, it's the access to a world, this kind of thing. So with television, it can do awful things, and I think we're beginning to get documentation. At last, some fairly certifiable documentation that the portrayal of violence on television either A, leads to violence or it leads to trivialization. I sometimes think that some of the confusion on the part of the young, creative confusion, but confusion in the time of the Vietnamese War, was that they'd seen violence on television so long and there was never any blood on the floor when it was over. And then they just thought you could just change the world nonviolently by doing violent type of activities. And then a mathematician at Armstrong Hall at the University of Wisconsin got killed one day, one person, and it suddenly hit them. Hey, people get killed in revolution. They had to have a different kind of thought. Somebody says the young aren't as involved in the nuclear disarmament thing as the older. I think it's because it's always been boxed into a little screen here. And they haven't seen the kinds of violence that the adult world that knew World War II and Korea and Vietnam has remembered. And therefore, they don't care quite as much. It's just, maybe they do care as much. I shouldn't speak for their generation, but they haven't been out there as much as the seniors have been. So television can lead to a false perception of reality. But let me close this by saying it can also do marvelous things. It can present ways of life we had not previously known. It can teach the Gentile Holocaust. It can teach the white roots. It can do all that and be an instrument for some sort of understanding, and it has done a lot of that. As I see it, we humans have what I call a kind of a psychic cuticle. Television reaches many dimensions of our life, our notions, our opinions, our attitudes, or whatever. Our deepest beliefs, our deepest ego patterns are set in the womb and in the living room and with the playmate or wherever. Thus, the whole enterprise to convert people to religion by television is almost utterly futile. It raises good money for the people doing it, to keep raising more money to keep doing it. But 0.004%, if I have the statistic right, of the American churchgoers say they got there thanks to the Ministry of Radio or Television. 4 out of 5 got there because somebody they knew or cared about invited them or got them involved. And I think that that's, if you're in television advertising, that's your great frustration. You have to give people the toothpaste as well as describe it for them to get started on it and so on. Try putting a controversial figure on television in a mixed audience, 20, 30 people in a living room, and put on a controversial figure, a Teddy Kennedy, a Jane Fonda, a Bill Buckley, or whatever. The people who are predisposed to them will like them more after 15 minutes. The people who didn't like them will like them less. It confirms the direction we're in. What I'm trying to say is I think there's a creative interplay between what we can do in our own lives and backyards to interpret the media which are here to stay and will be ever more enveloping, or we can be merely passive in their face and worry about the day when nothing but violence would be shown.
Dr. Marty, your talk to me is a very optimistic one, and yet as I listen to it, I ask myself, there are people out there slaughtering one another all throughout the world and in the name of religion of one sort or another. For them, the concept of argument, as you describe it, doesn't work. It may seem to hear, but how's it going to work out there in the world outside before we all kill each other?
Thank you. I wish the meeting had just ended before you asked that question, because it is the most important, troubling question that is the other side of what I just presented. And we have to face it. Is civility a luxury of the better off folk in a society where there are already measures of justice and goods? Yes. That is, much of the incivility in the world is born of scarcity and crowding and all the rest. Harold Isaacs begins his book, Idols of the Tribe, roughly like this. It'll be my poetic interpretation. Around the world today, there is a massive, convulsive ingathering of peoples into their separatenesses and over-againstnesses to protect their pride and power and place over against the real or perceived threats of other people and their pride and power and place. And that's not a big threat here, where there's enough food for most of us and a little bit of space between us or whatever. But if you're two tribes fighting over what's in West Kerala or Bengal or Bangladesh, you can't quite have it. To that I would say, you don't give up simply because it's a modest instrument. There are people in, say, Northern Ireland who have really worked and sometimes made gains in producing a measure of intergroup concord among many of the people to keep it from being a mere jungle. That would be an illustration. There are many others. There are resolutions of these, and people that used to fight still in a scarce world get together. What I think we have to do is face up to the issue, however, that civility and argument have appeared on the scene rarely. Greece and Rome had it, and it was a slave society. Renaissance had some, Enlightenment had some, but fundamentally it's kind of a 2-century-old invention of Northwest Europe and Anglo-America, and it's been exported to a few outer stops. It's very fragile. It can disappear in a couple of years. Germany saw it go in 2 years in the 30s, which is why I think those of us who are in societies where this gossamer thing is present have to be very alert to keeping it healthy and pure. But it is in some measure of conflict with justice. Philosopher Glenn Tyndall is faced up to this, and he said, we have to admit that. We have to know there are times when civility breaks down. Most Americans justified their revolution, which probably had far less cause, as far as injustice is concerned, as anything going on in Latin America or Africa today. There may come such a time. What do? You work as soon as possible toward the restoration of civility. You don't ever justify the incivility. You rather, if you see a suspension, you try to work toward the day when the new victor isn't merely a replacement of the old barbarian. And the other thing is, I think you have to do this, he says, and I agree with him. You have to ask, is there any social system that doesn't have as its corollary or underside injustice? The Marxian who would criticize the Westerner on these terms can't really point to a society where there's justice without argument. So you have to ask, if you're going to have some measure of injustice, which system is the one most likely to do the least damage on this front and build up after? But it is still something that we have to understand we're doing with a measure of uneasy conscience. It is a luxury, but we may be custodians of it for some other people. There are societies that have learned something from it. India's Constitution of 1947 was a deliberate patterning of this kind of thing and has brought it about. You can't simply export America, but I'd like to think we might be some agents of a mission still in the world.
Dr. Marty, much of what happened and is happening in Iran was a reaction to modernism. And I would like to know whether you believe this is something that is limited to the Shiite Muslims, or whether you see a return to fundamentalism and an antagonism towards modernism in all the world's great religions.
If everyone in range of my voice will not get confused between capital F fundamentalism in America and fundamentalism as a state of mind elsewhere, in words, I'm not saying American fundamentalists are like the Ayatollah. Please remember that. Then let me go on to say, in the spirit of your question, some of the things that occasioned that reaction to modernity there are occasioning it in our society. And that may be behind some of this impulse. People are bewildered by the diversity and pluralism in American life. They're tired of the many voices that come their way. They strike out at the instruments that have provided it, pluralism. They may not strike out at television. They may use television indeed to do the striking out in our society. They may not, as in the Islamic society, put the chador back on, but they will usually issue in nostalgic calls, seek modes of legislation that would say the whole society has to establish our belief system or whatever. And I think that's an understandable impulse, the reaction of modernity. It brings mixed blessings, and people are learning that. It's an understandable reaction, and I think we will be ill-served if we don't understand it, if you laugh at them instead of trying to understand it. Modernity is a mixed blessing. Some of the things that the tribes rising up have to say are cherishable old values.
Dr. Marty, you've spoken about the institutional and the clientele aspects I wonder if you'd care to comment more about the individual and that internal self-argument and agony and reaching some civility.
All right. The individual is often overlooked in this kind of pattern because a republic is not a glob of a mass of people. A republic is a community of sub-communities. E pluribus unum, out of many one, always in the process. Politics, in a sense, is a representation of overlapping interest groups. The more the better, as far as I'm concerned, so you don't have just single issues. But still, the individual matters. In my perception, I'm not expert at this, but I, as an historian, watch it in societies, I find the individual is usually healthiest in these if he or she is a member of one or more such groups where signals get called, because the absolutely alienated, isolated, lonely individual is the one on whom the totalitarian really feeds. The beliefless, rootless people are the dangerous ones in this society. The fashionable word for this is mediating structures. Sociologists invented that. Edmund Burke calls them the little platoons between you and Leviathan. And it seems to me membership in political parties, in churches, in synagogues, in neighborhood agencies, in voluntary associations, prepare people for dealing with many different sets of sometimes competing symbols, and then they are less likely to be raided by a single issue person or by a capital S, capital I, single issue force.
Comment on tax credits for non-public schools.
I think it's more a matter of policy than of rights. I have what I call the 13th grade rule in American life. We already have tuition tax credits for people in the 13th grade in many states. As you go to church-related school, you get a tuition tax rebate or the analog comparable thing to it. The issue is, does this society want to extend that kind of thing to elementary and secondary education? It has to calculate, what's best, if this is a danger to the public schools or whatever. I'm not strongly for them, but I don't think I would make a church-state case against them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Martin E. Marty, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. The Study Club Forum is adjourned.
It's kind of warm up here.